By the summer of 1943, the Reich was burning. Not from invasion, not from ground troops. From above. A single mission over Schweinfurt, on October 14, 1943, saw 291 American heavy bombers launch into the heart of Germany. 60 of them never came home. The crews that survived returned shaking, frostbitten, and half-deaf. And yet, within days, they were being ordered back into the sky. That is the story of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Not a story of easy victory, but of brutal attrition, staggering losses, and an industrial war fought at 30,000 feet. A campaign that cost the lives of over 160,000 Allied airmen and ultimately broke the spine of Nazi Germany's war machine. This is how it happened. When Adolf Hitler launched his war against Europe in September 1939, the Allied powers faced a fundamental problem that had no easy solution. Germany's industrial heartland, the factories, the refineries, the ball-bearing plants, and synthetic fuel facilities, lay deep inside the continent, unreachable by ground forces, defended by the most sophisticated air defense network the world had ever seen, protected by tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, radar installations, and the deadly fighters of the Luftwaffe. The only way to reach those targets was through the air, and the only aircraft capable of reaching them, surviving the journey, and delivering enough ordnance to matter were heavy strategic bombers. The British had been bombing Germany since May 1940. The Americans entered the European theater in 1942. Together, under the combined bomber offensive officially codified at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces would wage the most sustained aerial bombardment in human history. The RAF flew by night, targeting German cities and civilian morale through area bombing. The Americans flew by day, targeting specific industrial nodes with what they believed would be surgical precision. Both approaches were extraordinarily dangerous. Both cost lives at a rate that, today, is almost impossible to comprehend. And together, they would reshape the entire trajectory of the war. To understand how Allied air power crushed Nazi industry, you have to first understand what Nazi industry looked like in 1942. Germany's war economy was formidable, but it had vulnerabilities. The Reich depended heavily on synthetic oil produced at a handful of massive facilities, including the Luna Works near Merseburg and the massive IG Farben plant at Ludwigshafen. It depended on ball bearings, the small, critical components that made every tank turret, every aircraft engine, and every artillery piece function, produced primarily at Schweinfurt, a single mid-sized city in Bavaria. It depended on aircraft production plants spread across the continent, from Wiener Neustadt in Austria to Regensburg in southern Germany. Destroy those nodes, American strategists argued, and the entire German war machine would grind to a halt. The theory was called precision daylight bombing. The aircraft chosen to execute it was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was not a revolutionary aircraft in terms of propulsion technology. It used for Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing around 1,200 horsepower, to carry a bomb load of up to 8,000 pounds over ranges exceeding 2,000 miles in its later variants. What made it remarkable was its durability, its altitude ceiling of over 35,000 feet in ideal conditions, and the sheer concentration of defensive firepower. It carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns in its final B-17G configuration. American planners believed that formations of flying fortresses could fight their way to targets without escort. That belief would be tested and nearly destroyed over the skies of Germany. The early missions of the 8th Air Force, flying from bases in East Anglia, under commanders including Brigadier General Ire Eker, struck targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. These raids were manageable. German fighter opposition was fierce, but losses were survivable. Then came the push deeper into Reich territory, and everything changed. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-1090 were exceptional fighter aircraft. German pilots, many of them veterans of combat over Britain, over the Mediterranean, over the Eastern Front, understood how to attack bomber formations with ruthless efficiency. They concentrated their fire on the lead aircraft. They executed head-on passes to bypass the tail gunners. They fired rockets from outside the range of the bombers' defensive guns. On the first Schweinfurt raid of August 17, 1943, 60 B-17s were lost in a single day. 376 men killed, missing, or captured in the space of a few hours. That same day, another formation hit the Messerschmitt production facility at Regensburg, and then continued south into North Africa in a daring double strike conceived by Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commanding the 3rd Bombardment Division. The Regensburg element lost 24 aircraft. The combined mission destroyed or damaged hundreds of Bf-109 airframes on the production line. but the human cost was catastrophic. When the second Schweinfurt mission launched that October, the mission that would go down in history as Black Thursday, it became clear that unescorted deep penetration bombing was not a sustainable strategy. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration raids. The question facing Allied air commanders was stark. How do you escort bombers deep into Germany when no fighter aircraft in the Allied inventory can fly that far? The answer came from an unexpected source. The North American P-51 Mustang had been developed originally for the British in 1940, designed in an extraordinarily compressed timeline. Legend has it the initial design was completed in just 117 days. Early versions used an Allison V1710 engine and were mediocre at high altitude. But when Rolls-Royce engineers tested the airframe with the Merlin 61 engine in late 1942, the transformation was stunning. The combination produced a fighter with a range, when fitted with drop tanks, that could reach Berlin and beyond. The aircraft that emerged, the P-51D Mustang with its Packard V1650-27 Merlin engine, became the instrument that changed the entire character of the strategic bombing campaign. General Henry Hap Arno, commanding the Army Air Forces, understood what the long-range escort fighter meant. He issued a directive to his 8th Air Force commanders that was blunt and historically significant. The bombers were not the primary objective. The Luftwaffe was. American fighter pilots were ordered to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found, including strafing them on their airfields. The goal was not merely to protect the bombers on any individual mission. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. It worked. Through early 1944, in a campaign that came to be known as Big Week, formerly designated Operation Argument and executed from February 20th through 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched approximately 3,800 bomber sorties against German aircraft manufacturing facilities, while long-range P-51 escorts engaged the Luftwaffe over its own territory. German fighter production was disrupted, and more critically, experienced German fighter pilots were killed at a rate the Luftwaffe could not replace. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later acknowledged that German fighter production recovered remarkably quickly from the factory bombings through dispersal and underground construction, but experienced pilots could not be manufactured. The attrition of German fighter crews in the spring of 1944 was irreplaceable. The consolidated B-2 for Liberta, operating alongside the B-17 from both England and the Mediterranean theater, extended the reach of the campaign. The B-24D that struck the Plosi oil refineries in Romania. On August 1, 1943, Operation Tidal Wave flew at altitudes, sometimes below 100 feet, in a low-level attack designed to achieve surprise. The mission was one of the most decorated in American military history. 5 Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded for a single operation. 53 aircraft were lost out of 177 that reached the target, and the damage to the refineries, while initially significant, was repaired within weeks. Plosti would have to be struck again and again throughout 1944, systematically, by high-altitude formations operating from newly captured Italian bases following the fall of Rome. The RAF's contribution to the campaign operated under a fundamentally different philosophy and used different aircraft. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding Bomber Command from High Wycombe, from February 1942 onward, believed that area bombing of German cities, the systematic destruction of worker housing, transportation infrastructure, and civilian morale, could break Germany's will to fight. The instrument of his campaign was the Avro Lancaster, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and capable of carrying bomb loads that dwarfed American aircraft, including the 12,000-pound Tallboy and the 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bombs designed by Barnes Wallis and used against hardened targets, including U-boat pens and railway viaducts. The Lancaster's bomb bay had been deliberately designed without the structural spars that limited the B-17 and B-24, allowing it to carry a single massive bomb if needed. The aircraft's range and ceiling were adequate for most German targets, and its crews, flying in darkness to avoid the worst of the fighter opposition, developed sophisticated navigation and target marking techniques under the guidance of the Pathfinder Force, established by Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett in August 1942, operating from RAF Wyton and later RAF Oakington. The Pathfinder concept was critical. Early British bombing raids had been devastatingly inaccurate. A 1941 analysis by MP and statistician David Butt had found that only a fraction of bombs fell within 5 miles of their intended targets. The Pathfinder Force used specialized navigation equipment, the G hyperbolic navigation system, then the more accurate oboe blind bombing system developed by Alec Reeves and F.E. Jones, and operated by No. 109 Squadron 2 marked targets with incendiary flares, cold target indicators, before the main bomber stream arrived. Accuracy improved substantially, though civilian casualties remained catastrophic. The moral dimension of the area bombing campaign remains contested among historians. What is documented is its industrial effect. By mid-1944, following the combined bomber offensives, systematic prioritization of the German oil industry pushed forward strategically. By USAAF Colonel Richard Hughes and endorsed by General Karl Spaatz, German fuel production collapsed. Synthetic oil output fell from 316,000 tons in May 1944 to 17,000 tons by September 1944, following relentless attacks on facilities including Luna, BRX, and Blech. German aircraft were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tank crews were trained and never committed to battle because there was no petrol to move them. The Luftwaffe's response to Allied air supremacy included the deployment of genuinely revolutionary aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, introduced to combat in mid-1944, powered by two Junkers, Jumo 004B, axial flow turbojet engines, and capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied piston-engine aircraft, and its 30mm cannon armament was devastating against bomber formations. But it arrived too late, in too few numbers. And with too many mechanical deficiencies, the Jumo 004 engines had a service life of only around 25 hours to alter the strategic situation. Allied bombing of German airfields, fuel supplies, and manufacturing dispersal sites limited the Me-262's operational effectiveness. P-51 pilots learned to intercept it during its vulnerable approach and landing phases when its speed advantage disappeared. By the spring of 1945, German industry was not merely damaged, it was disintegrating. The railway network systematically attacked from late 1944 onward, through the transportation plan championed by British scientist Solly Zuckerman, had collapsed. Coal could not move from the Ruhr. Steel could not be smelted. Finished weapons sat in factories without the fuel, parts, or logistics infrastructure to reach the front. German tank production, which Albert Speer had managed to increase through most of 1943 and 1944, through remarkable organizational feats, finally fell sharply in the first months of 1945 as raw materials supply chains disintegrated entirely. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war with access to German industrial records and captured officials, including Speer himself, concluded that the oil campaign and the transportation campaign, executed in the final year of the war, had been decisive. Speer told interrogators flatly that the attacks on synthetic oil plants had been the most serious blow to German war production. The ball-bearing campaign against Schweinfurt, by contrast, had been less decisive than American planners believed, in part because German industry had stockpiled bearings and found substitute suppliers in Sweden and elsewhere. What the survey could not fully quantify was the cumulative psychological and organizational effect of years of bombing on German industrial management, worker productivity, and military planning. The constant disruption, the forced dispersal of factories into forests and tunnels, the diversion of over 1 million men and thousands of heavy guns to anti-aircraft defense, an enormous portion of Germany's total military resources, committed not to fighting the Soviets or the Western Allies on the ground, but to defending the sky, represented a strategic diversion of incalculable value. Over 160,000 Allied airmen died in the strategic bombing campaign. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force faced odds that, at the campaign's worst periods, made survival to the end of a 25-mission tour statistically unlikely. The Rose Bomber Command lost 55,573 dead, the highest casualty rate of any British service branch in the entire war. These were not abstract numbers. These were young men from Ohio and Yorkshire and Manitoba and New South Wales, climbing into cold aluminum aircraft in the early morning dark, knowing the mathematics of survival, and climbing in anyway. They broke the Nazi industrial machine, not cleanly, not surgically, not without enormous cost to themselves and to German civilians caught beneath them, but they broke it. And when the final German surrenders came in May 1945, when the factories fell silent and the last aircraft rolled to a stop on cratered runways, the strategic air campaign stood as one of the most consequential and most costly chapters in the history of air power.